Cowboy dragged Apache out of river ice, and the rider returning at dusk changed his entire fate. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. James Turner had never been one to shy away from hard work, but even a man like him couldn't ignore the sound of desperation carried by the wind. It was late afternoon when the ice on the river cracked under the weight of something heavy. The harsh winter had frozen the river solid, leaving a deadly barrier for anyone unfortunate enough to fall in. James had lived out here, isolated from the rest of the world, for years. His only company was the cattle he tended and the occasional traveler who passed through. But today, it was something more than a traveler that caught his attention. The muffled cries, barely audible above the wind, were enough to make him stop. His gaze shifted towards the river. At first, he saw nothing but the white, frozen expanse. Then, there was movement. A figure struggling against the current, their body half submerged in the freezing water. Without thinking, James grabbed his coat and rushed toward the riverbank. The figure was a man, a Native American, caught in the grip of the river's icy hold. James could see the man's face, pale with the cold, his eyes wide with panic. Without hesitation, James dove into the water. The biting cold nearly took his breath away, but he pushed through. Every step felt like a battle against the current, but James was determined. He reached the man and, with all his strength, pulled him towards the shore. It was slow going, the weight of the man dragging them both down, but James refused to give up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the bank. James hauled the man to safety, his own body trembling from the cold. He looked down at the stranger, who was unconscious but alive. James didn't know who the man was, but that didn't matter now. All that mattered was that he had saved him. The sun was setting by the time James had built a fire and wrapped the man in blankets to warm him. He didn't know how long it would take for the stranger to wake, but James stayed by his side, watching over him as the darkness of night fell. The last thing he expected was for this stranger to change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As the fire crackled, James heard the sound of hooves approaching in the distance. He looked up, squinting into the growing twilight. A rider was coming down the narrow path that led to his cabin. The rider was tall, his figure outlined against the dusky sky. James could feel a strange tension building in his chest. The rider's arrival seemed almost inevitable, as if fate had brought him here for a reason. The stranger, still unconscious by the fire, was about to find out just how deep the roots of this night ran. And James? Well, his fate was about to change forever. The night was falling fast, and the fire crackled beside James as he sat silently, watching over the man he had pulled from the ice-cold river. The winds of winter howled through the trees, but the warmth from the fire was a comfort, a temporary reprieve from the harshness of the world. James' thoughts were scattered. He wondered who the stranger was, what brought him to this frozen river on such a brutal evening. He glanced down at the man again, his body wrapped tightly in blankets, his chest rising and falling slowly, but steadily. It had been hours since James pulled him from the water, and there had been no signs of waking yet. The firelight flickered, casting shadows on the wooden walls of the cabin. James' mind wandered, but a soft sound pulled him back to the present. The sound of hooves sharp and steady, breaking the stillness of the night. He stood up quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle by the door. His eyes narrowed, scanning the darkness outside, trying to make out the figure approaching. There was only one rider, a solitary figure cutting through the fog of the cold evening. As the rider came closer, James' heart beat a little faster, an inexplicable feeling crawling up his spine. Something about the rider felt different, not like a regular traveler or even a danger, but something deeper. Something he couldn't name. The rider reached the cabin and slowed his horse to a stop. The man dismounted gracefully, his presence commanding the space as he approached James, eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made James pause. "You don't know me, but I know you," the rider said, his voice calm, yet carrying an authority that made James hesitate. "Name's Hunter Blackwell." James said nothing for a moment, studying the man who stood before him. The name sounded familiar, but not enough to place. He had heard it, perhaps in passing, but never met the man himself. The stranger continued, his gaze never wavering. "I've come for him," he said, nodding towards the unconscious figure by the fire. "I knew it would end like this, but I didn't expect it to be so soon." James frowned, confused by the words. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. "What do you mean?" he asked. Hunter didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder at the man lying by the fire. "You've done more than you know," Hunter said softly. "This man." He paused, looking at the stranger again. "He's no ordinary man. He's someone I've been searching for." James' heart raced, his confusion growing. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice a little more urgent now. Hunter finally looked at James, his eyes piercing. "He's someone who could change the balance of everything. And it's because of you that we're here now." James took a step back, the weight of the words sinking in. He didn't understand what this stranger meant, but one thing was clear: this was no simple encounter. The fire flickered, casting long shadows in the room. The air was thick with the tension of unspoken things, and for the first time in a long while, James felt like he was a part of something much bigger than himself. Something that would shape his future in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. As Hunter Blackwell stood there, waiting for James to process the gravity of what he had just said, the man by the fire stirred. James looked over quickly, his breath catching in his throat. The stranger's eyes opened slowly, and as they met James' gaze, there was an unmistakable sense of recognition, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. "You saved me," the man whispered hoarsely, his voice thick with the weight of both gratitude and something darker. "And now, we're both in this together." James' mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything that was unfolding. But one thing was certain: his life would never be the same. He had crossed the line, pulled a stranger from the river, and in doing so, he had changed the course of his own fate. The night was far from over, and the story of how it would unfold was just beginning. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls as James Turner stood over the stranger who had now awoken. The man's name, as James had learned, was Taji. He was a member of the Apache tribe, though he carried a deeper, unspoken history that seemed to weigh heavily upon him. Taji's eyes, sharp and intense, locked with James's. "I owe you my life," Taji said, his voice rough but sincere. James didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied the man carefully, trying to understand the significance of what had happened. He had saved this man, but why was Hunter Blackwell now involved? What was it that made this moment so important? "You've done more than save me," Taji continued, breaking the silence. "You've set something in motion." James shifted uncomfortably, the weight of those words sinking in. What did that mean? Taji's gaze softened as he saw the confusion in James's eyes. "You may not understand now, but you will," Taji said, as if reading James's mind. Hunter Blackwell, standing by the door, watched the exchange in silence. The atmosphere was thick with something unsaid, a quiet tension hanging in the air. "He's right," Hunter spoke up, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "You've done more than offer shelter to a stranger. You've unknowingly opened a door to something bigger than either of us." James turned to face Hunter, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his patience thinning. "I'm talking about fate," Hunter replied, stepping closer. "By saving Taji, you've aligned yourself with something larger. There are forces at work here, forces that neither you nor I can easily control." James's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what was happening. His peaceful life, his simple existence on the farm, had just been upended by a chance encounter with a man on the brink of death. And now, a mysterious rider had shown up, claiming that everything was about to change. Taji let out a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. The Apache people are in danger, he said finally, his tone grave. There are enemies coming, and they seek to destroy what we have built. I have been chosen to lead my people, but I cannot do it alone. I need allies. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He was no warrior, no leader. He was just a man trying to survive in a harsh world. And what does that have to do with me? James asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Taji's eyes met his again, this time with a depth of understanding. You may not realize it, James, but you've already proven yourself to be someone we can trust. Someone who knows what it means to protect the innocent. James was silent, taking in Taji's words. It was hard to believe that someone like him, a simple rancher, could be part of something so grand. You've chosen a path now, Hunter added, his voice firm. And there's no going back. But trust me, James, you've made the right choice. We need you. James stared at the two men, feeling the weight of their words pressing down on him. He had always been a man of action, not words, but this was something he had never imagined. The wind howled outside, a reminder of the world they all lived in, a world that was constantly shifting, constantly changing. I don't know what's coming, James finally said, his voice steady. But if you think I can help, then I'll do what I can. Taji nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. That's all we ask? As the night stretched on, the fire flickered, and James's mind began to process the enormity of what lay ahead. The simple act of saving a life had set a chain of events into motion that he could no longer ignore. And though he didn't know where this path would lead, one thing was clear: his life was no longer just his own. He had stepped into something much bigger, and there was no turning back. The next morning, the sky was a pale blue, the sun slowly creeping over the horizon as James Turner stood outside his cabin, staring into the vast, quiet land that stretched before him. He had spent his life here, alone, working the fields and tending to his cattle. But now, everything had changed. The man he had pulled from the icy river, Taji, was not just a stranger. He was a part of something bigger. A part of a tribe, a people with a destiny far beyond James's understanding. Hunter Blackwell had remained with them through the night, speaking little but always watching, as if he were waiting for something. It's time, Hunter said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. James turned to face him. Time for what? He asked, his voice still thick with confusion. We have a long journey ahead, Hunter replied. The Apache people need your help. The enemies I spoke of, they are closer than we think. But we are not alone. We will have allies. James frowned. Allies? Yes, Taji spoke, his voice still hoarse from the cold, but growing stronger by the hour. There are others, men and women, who will stand with us. Together, we will defend what is ours. James hesitated, looking back at the cabin, at the life he had built alone. He had always prided himself on his independence, his ability to face challenges alone. But this was different. This was a battle of something more than just survival. This was about protecting a way of life, a people, a future. I don't know if I'm the right man for this, James said quietly, his eyes on the distant hills. I'm no warrior. Taji stepped forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. You've already proven yourself to be more than you know, he said. The path you've chosen, the help you've given, it means something. Hunter nodded in agreement. You've already made your mark, James. It's not about being a warrior. It's about standing for what's right, what's worth protecting. James felt a weight settle on his shoulders, heavier than any load he had ever carried before. But there was something else, too. Something in the way Taji spoke, in the way Hunter stood so firmly beside him, that made him feel as if he had a purpose here. A purpose he had never known until now. I'll help, James said, his voice firm now. But I need to know more. What exactly are we up against? Hunter looked at him, then to Taji, before answering. They are men who seek to take what isn't theirs. They want to erase the Apache way of life, to push our people off the land we've lived on for generations. They will stop at nothing to get what they want. Taji's voice grew cold, his eyes hardening. But we will fight for what's ours. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 battles, of generations of Apache warriors who had fought to protect their land, their culture, and their people. James felt a surge of something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of duty. A sense of belonging. He was no warrior, but he was a man who could stand by his word, by his actions. And right now, that was enough. "All right," James said, his voice stronger now. "Let's do this." The wind picked up, a sign of the coming change. The world around them was shifting, and James knew that this moment, this decision, would change everything. There was no turning back now. Together, they would face whatever was to come. And whatever the future held, James was ready to stand by them. He was ready to fight for something worth fighting for. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting light on the path ahead, and James, Hunter, and Taji made their way out into the world beyond the cabin, where their journey awaited them. A journey that would shape their destinies and the future of a people. And as they walked, James couldn't help but feel a sense of hope, something he hadn't known in years. It was a strange feeling, but a welcome one. A feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, he had found where he truly belonged. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but James Turner walked it with a new sense of purpose. The sun hung high in the sky as the trio made their way through the rugged terrain, heading towards the Apache camp. The land stretched wide before them, the soft winds rustling through the sparse trees. As they walked, James's thoughts were a swirl of questions. What was coming? What did Taji and Hunter mean when they spoke of enemies? The path had become more than just a journey, it had become a mission. "How far are we from the camp?" James asked, breaking the silence. Taji, walking ahead with a steady pace, glanced back at him. "Not far now," he said, his voice calm but filled with an underlying weight. "But when we arrive, things will change. We will need to prepare." James nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered. "Prepare for what?" Hunter, who had been walking beside James, spoke up. "The people who seek to destroy the Apache way of life are more than just a few. They are organized, powerful, and relentless. But we have something they don't, a cause worth fighting for." James felt the weight of Hunter's words, their seriousness sinking in deeper. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. He had saved Taji's life, yes, but this journey, this cause, was something far greater. As the landscape changed, the rocky hills gave way to a valley, and in the distance, James could see the outlines of the Apache camp. Tents were pitched, fires smoldered, and the air was alive with activity. It was a far cry from the quiet isolation of James's farm, but something about the place felt right. It felt like a place where strength was forged in the fires of hardship, and where honor was held above all else. When they finally reached the camp, they were met by a few of the tribe's warriors. They were tall, strong, and silent, their eyes wary but respectful as they took in the three travelers. Taji spoke briefly with one of the warriors in their native language, his words quick and purposeful. After a moment, the warrior nodded and gestured for them to follow. "This way," the warrior said, his voice deep and firm. The camp was bustling with activity, but the mood was somber. There was a sense of readiness in the air, as if the tribe was preparing for something inevitable. The warriors moved with precision, gathering weapons, tending to the fires, and organizing themselves into groups. It was clear that something was on the horizon, and everyone was ready. Taji led James and Hunter to a central fire where the tribe's leader, a tall and weathered man with graying hair, was waiting. His presence was commanding, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of experience. "Taji," the leader said, his eyes flicking to James and Hunter. "You've brought them." Taji nodded. "Yes, Chief. This is James Turner, the man who saved my life. He has proven himself to be an ally." The chief's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied James. "An outsider," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But his actions speak louder than his origin. We will see what kind of man he truly is." James stood tall, though his heart pounded in his chest. He had never imagined himself standing before a leader like this. The weight of the tribe's gaze was heavy, but he didn't look away. He had made his choice. "I'm here to help," James said, his voice steady. "Whatever it takes." The chief looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Good," he said. "We will need all the help we can get. There is a storm coming, and it is one that will test us all." James felt a surge of determination rise within him. He had no idea what this storm would bring, but he knew one thing for sure: he was ready. Ready to stand beside these people, ready to fight for something worth fighting for. The winds picked up as the sky grew darker, and James knew that the battle ahead would be unlike anything he had ever known. But he wasn't alone. He had found his place, his purpose, and together, they would face whatever came their way. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the Apache camp. James stood by the fire, his mind racing with the events of the past few days. The weight of the chief's words still hung heavy in the air. A storm was coming, but what kind of storm? As the fire crackled, he felt a sense of unease. Everything had changed. He was no longer just a simple rancher. He had become part of something much bigger, something that he could not yet fully comprehend. Taji approached him quietly, his footsteps soft on the earth. "You're still thinking about it," Taji said, his voice low but steady. James nodded. "I can't help it," he replied. "This is all so new to me." Taji studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You are not the only one who feels uncertain," he said. "But you are here for a reason, James. You have proven yourself, not just to me, but to the chief and to the tribe." James looked into Taji's eyes, searching for something, reassurance perhaps. But all he found was sincerity. "I didn't choose this," James said quietly. "It chose me." Taji's expression softened. "Sometimes, fate works in ways we cannot understand. But it is still our choice to follow it." James turned his gaze to the horizon, where the last light of day was fading. He could feel the pull of something, an invisible thread drawing him forward. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't turn back. The sound of hooves caught his attention, and he turned to see Hunter Blackwell approaching. The man's face was set in a grim expression, his eyes scanning the camp. "There's word from the scouts," Hunter said, dismounting his horse. "The enemy is moving closer. We have to be ready." James felt a chill run down his spine. He had known, deep down, that this moment was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. The enemy was closer than they thought. The Apache camp had been preparing for weeks, but now, the time to act was drawing near. The chief stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around the fire. "Gather the warriors," he said. "Tonight we begin." The air around them seemed to shift, the weight of the moment settling in. James could feel the tension in the camp rise, the warriors moving with purpose, preparing for the battle that was to come. He had not signed up for war, but war had found him. Taji approached him again, his eyes meeting James's with a look that spoke volumes. "We fight not just for ourselves," Taji said, "but for our future, for our children, and for the land that we have protected for generations." James nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what was at stake. This was no longer just about survival. It was about preserving something much greater than themselves. The fire flickered, casting an eerie glow on the faces of the warriors as they gathered around the chief. James stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He was ready to stand with these people, ready to fight for something worth fighting for. The storm was coming, and James would face it head-on, alongside the Apache people. The wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of change. Tonight, everything would shift. And James knew, deep in his bones, that the man he was before this journey would never return. The battle for their future had begun, and he was a part of it, whether he was ready or not. The night had fallen completely, the camp filled with the soft murmur of warriors preparing for the unknown. James stood at the edge, his hands resting on his hips as he watched the figures moving in the shadows. There was a sense of quiet determination in the air, a heavy weight that settled over everyone. This wasn't just a fight, it was a fight for survival, for the future, and for the land that had given them life. James felt it deep in his chest, the urgency of it all. The flames of the campfire flickered, casting a soft glow on the faces around him. He couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, like a storm was brewing just beyond the horizon. He had been thrust into this world, a world so different from the one he had known, and now there was no turning back. Taji approached, his steps quiet but purposeful. His eyes, though tired, were filled with a fire that mirrored the one burning in the center of the camp. "James," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years of hardship. "Tonight, we will fight not just for our lives, but for what we hold dear." James nodded, his jaw tight. "I know. I'm ready." Taji's gaze softened slightly, and for a moment, James could see the man beneath the warrior. The weight of leadership was not lost on him, and James could feel the burden of it in the air. "You are ready," Taji said. "But remember, we fight with honor. We do not fight out of hate, but out of love for what we have built." James thought about the land, the quiet mornings on his farm, the simple life he had lived. And now, here he was, preparing to fight for something much bigger than himself. The wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves of the trees around them. The scent of the earth, the smoke from the fire, and the distant sound of the horses gave the night an eerie, almost surreal quality. It was the calm before the storm. Hunter Blackwell walked over to join them, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had been quiet for most of the night, but now, there was a seriousness in his demeanor that James had not seen before. "We have scouts in place," Hunter said, his voice steady. "They'll let us know if the enemy is moving. We'll have to be swift, but we have the advantage of surprise." James looked at him, a deep sense of responsibility settling over him. "What do we do if they come before we're ready?" he asked. Hunter turned to face him, his gaze unwavering. "We fight, James. We fight with everything we have." The tension in the camp grew as the minutes passed, the warriors continuing their preparations in silence. James could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his thoughts racing. He wasn't a soldier, but tonight, he would be. He would fight for Taji, for the Apache people, and for the future that they all shared. The night stretched on, and the fire in the center of the camp burned brightly, a beacon in the darkness. The hours passed slowly, each moment heavy with anticipation. Then, just as the moon reached its peak in the sky, a scout returned, his silhouette framed by the firelight. "They're coming," the scout said, his voice urgent. "It's time." James took a deep breath, his muscles tensing as the weight of the moment settled over him. This was it. There was no turning back now. The tribe rallied together, their movements swift and coordinated. Taji stood beside James, his expression focused. "Follow me," he said, and James fell in line. The warriors, united in their purpose, moved through the night like shadows, silent and determined. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were ready. James had joined them in this fight, and together, they would face whatever came next. The camp, once a place of quiet preparation, had transformed into a place of action. The storm was coming, and they would stand their ground. They would not let their way of life be taken without a fight. The air was thick with tension as James, Taji, and the rest of the tribe's warriors moved silently through the night. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the landscape, and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. The tribe had gathered, every warrior prepared for the battle that was about to unfold. James had never experienced anything like this before. He had always lived alone, quiet and isolated, but now he was part of something much bigger, something that called for courage and strength. As they neared the edge of the forest, the outline of their enemies appeared on the horizon. The shapes were dark, moving slowly, but there was no mistaking their intent. They were close now. "Stay sharp," Taji whispered to James, his eyes scanning the horizon. "This is it." We stand together, or we fall apart. James nodded, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of the knife at his side. He wasn't a fighter, not by trade, but he had learned quickly in these past days that survival depended on more than just strength. It was about unity, about standing firm in the face of whatever came their way. Hunter Blackwell stepped forward, his expression hard and focused. "Remember, we don't fight to destroy," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet night. "We fight to protect. We defend what is ours." The warriors around him nodded in agreement. There was no question about their resolve. They were ready. As the enemy drew closer, James could feel his pulse quicken. The adrenaline was starting to build, a rising tide of awareness that made every sound feel sharper, every movement more deliberate. "Get in position," Taji ordered, and the warriors scattered, blending into the shadows like ghosts. James followed Taji's lead, moving carefully to a position behind a large rock, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence around them was almost suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. As the enemy approached, James could see the outlines of their figures more clearly now, men, armed and ready, their faces set with determination. There were too many of them, far more than James had anticipated. His mind raced as he scanned the enemy lines, trying to find a way out, trying to figure out what they were up against. But there was no time for second-guessing. The battle had begun. A horn sounded in the distance, a sharp, piercing note that echoed through the trees. It was the signal. The warriors around James sprang into action, moving swiftly and silently, each one knowing their place in the fight. James hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but then he saw Taji move, a shadow in the night, and followed him without a second thought. The clash of steel and the shouts of battle filled the air as the two sides collided. James found himself in the thick of it, moving quickly, doing his best to stay out of harm's way, but always within reach of Taji, who fought with the grace of a seasoned warrior. The enemy was strong, but the Apache warriors were fiercer. James could see it in their eyes, the fire that burned in them, the willingness to protect their land and their people at any cost. As the battle raged on, James felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had no weapons, no skills, but he had something else. He had the knowledge that he was standing with people who believed in something worth fighting for. Hours passed in what felt like moments, and the enemy began to retreat, their resolve breaking under the relentless pressure of the Apache warriors. Slowly, the sounds of battle faded, replaced by the quiet of the night. James stood amidst the smoke and the scattered debris, his breath heavy but steady. Taji came over to him, his face grim but relieved. "We've won," he said, his voice quiet but filled with pride. James nodded, feeling the weight of the victory settle in. It wasn't just a victory on the battlefield. It was a victory for something much more important, their way of life. As the warriors gathered around, their faces lit by the glow of the dying fire, James couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had been a part of this, a part of something that was bigger than anything he had ever known. The battle was over, but the fight was far from finished. The Apache people had won this night, but their enemies would return. And James knew, deep in his heart, that he would stand with them again, ready to protect the land, the people, and the future that they all shared. The days that followed the battle were filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment, but the air was still heavy with the understanding that this victory was only temporary. James had seen the Apache warriors at their best, unified, strong, and proud. But even in the aftermath of their success, there was an unspoken recognition that the true test was yet to come. As James walked through the camp, he felt a new sense of belonging. He had come from a life of solitude, but now, he was a part of something much bigger. The Apache people, though small in number, had proven their strength, and James had found his place among them. Taji approached him one morning, his expression more thoughtful than usual. "James," he said, "there is more to do. The enemy will not rest after this defeat. We must be prepared." James nodded, understanding the weight of Taji's words. "I'm with you," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever comes next, I'll stand with you." Taji smiled slightly, his eyes softening. I know. And for that, we are grateful. Over the following weeks, the camp became a hive of activity. The warriors trained relentlessly, honing their skills, preparing for the possibility that their enemies would soon return. James, though not a fighter by nature, found himself learning quickly, picking up the ways of the Apache in order to help in whatever way he could. He learned the basics of survival, tracking, and even how to use a bow. It wasn't much compared to the warriors who had grown up in this life, but it was enough for him to feel like he was contributing. Hunter Blackwell remained a quiet presence in the camp, his sharp eyes always watching, always aware. James had come to respect the man's calm demeanor, though he couldn't help but wonder what it was that had brought him to the Apache camp in the first place. One afternoon, as James worked on a nearby fire, Hunter approached him, his steps deliberate. "You've come a long way," Hunter said, his voice steady. "In just a short time, you've shown more heart than many who have been raised in this life." James glanced up at him, surprised by the compliment. "I didn't choose any of this," he said, his voice a bit rough. "But I can't turn back now. I've found something here. Something worth fighting for." Hunter nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's not always about choosing the path, James. Sometimes the path chooses you." James thought about that for a long moment, feeling the weight of Hunter's words. There was truth in them. His life had changed the moment he had pulled Taji from the river, and now, he was part of something far bigger than himself. The sound of approaching riders broke his thoughts, and James stood up, his eyes scanning the horizon. The scout had returned. "They're coming," the scout said, his voice grim. "It's time." The camp sprang into action, the warriors preparing as they had before. James joined them, his heart pounding, but this time, there was no fear. There was only determination. He was ready. The enemy had underestimated them before, but now, they would face the full strength of the Apache people. As the warriors gathered, the chief stepped forward, his eyes filled with resolve. "This is our land. Our people. And we will not let anyone take it from us," he said, his voice carrying through the camp. James felt a fire stir inside him as the chief's words echoed in his chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about preserving everything they had fought for, everything they had built together. The Apache were a family, bound not just by blood, but by a shared purpose. And James was part of that purpose now. Together, they would stand strong. Together, they would face whatever came next.